right, welcome back. So the secret word for this session is pioneer. And I think we'll all agree that our keynote speaker is indeed a pioneer. I took a little peek at the leaderboard, and I want to give a shout out to Lily, who is in first place. So you've been entering all the words correctly, and we'll be checking in periodically. All right, now, oh my God, Nick, I'm so excited to meet you. You have been such an inspiration to so many people. So Nick Szabo, he's a computer scientist. He's a law specialist. He's a cryptographer. And he really built the intellectual building blocks decades ago for everything we're talking about here. So Nick designed a digital cryptocurrency called BitGold. That was in 1998. That was a full 10 years before the Bitcoin white paper. But one of the things that I'm so excited about meeting you, Nick, is this paper that you wrote in 1997, where it's called Formalizing and Securing Relationships on Public Networks. But really what you talked about was this whole idea. You invented the idea of smart contracts and how they can be used to reduce transaction costs. So Nick, I know you're not a person who seeks the spotlight, but I'm making a prediction. I'm probably not the first one who's made it. I think someday you're going to win a Nobel Prize in economics for this idea, right? Because we had Ronald Coase, who developed transaction cost as a construct, win the Nobel Prize in economics. We had his student, Oliver Williamson, who formalized the theory. And now you, with the next generation of how this can be automated. I can tell you our business professionals and our students can't wait to hear your talking points today, Nick. So I'll turn it over to you. And when you're ready for audience questions, just give me a shout and I'll come back on.
Thank you. Indeed, Coase and Williamson were indeed two of my inspirations for this. So let's go back to the year 1956. Tanks are rolling down the streets of Hungary, putting down a glorious but futile rebellion by the Hungarians against the Soviet Empire. Thousands were killed, thousands had to leave refugees, including my father. He instilled in me a skepticism of government power, relying on it, and a libertarian worldview. So fast forward to the 1990s, I was part of a loose-knit online culture called the cypherpunks. We wanted to apply computer science to minimize the vulnerability to strangers, and we were trying to solve ambitious problems, such as make a non-governmental form of money, a private or non-governmental form of money has been a dream of libertarians, and non-violently enforce property contracts. Libertarians value, like our society values, our legal system anyway, values property rights and contracts. But they do depend on the force of government and traditionally done. So we wanted to get something that did not depend on the same people who could send tanks down your streets. So out of this environment, these kinds of motivations, but again, those are big utopian. Out of this environment and these kinds of motivations, for smart contracts, for blockchains, and for cryptocurrencies. So, and today we have a much more popular and immediately driving motive for this, price. Strong market signal, particularly Bitcoin. So you take into account Bitcoin's volatility into a risk-adjusted ratio, what is called a Sharpe ratio, over 4-year periods. Since that first famous Bitcoin for pizza transaction, Bitcoin has beaten all other financial assets in this risk-adjusted ratio of return. It's a very strong market. The question is, how do we explain this market? So hopefully my talk today will contribute to that explanation. So let's start with the underlying technology of blockchain. Good public blockchain is trust minimized. It traps transactions in an immutable record, like flies trapped in amber. And by contrast, you have traditional centralized databases that they're kind of like computational Etch-a-Sketch. There's a centralized administrator who can revise or erase its memory at will. And so when you're trusting a remote database, you're trusting that organization that was administrators. We don't know. We don't know what. So why is this trust minimization, this broad view of security important? Well, for several reasons. Global seamlessness. It comes from not depending on governments. If you don't depend on governments, then you are globally seamless, and the protocol can work anywhere in the world, anywhere the internet goes. And that gives you social scalability, which means you can deal with more people, more diverse kinds of people in more parts of the globe. And that turns out to be more economically valuable than computational scalability, the sheer performance ability. Lots of people. And securely permissionless. And again, that lowers costs for everybody, it lowers risk for everybody if you're securely permissionless. And the third reason security is important is it allows, trust minimization is important, broad view, is it allows a blockchain to be censorship resistant. And again, that lowers costs and risk for everybody involved and allows you to incorporate a wider, more diverse group of people. So that security, that trust minimization comes at a big cost in terms of traditional computation resources and scalability. We do proof of work, mining, which is very complicated. And we have broadcast replication. There's thousands of copies, tens of thousands of copies of Bitcoin around the world, thousands of them live and talking to each other and up on each other's work. So that comes at a complicated cost, but that's so cheap that for something you really want trust minimization for, such as a global currency, globally seamless currency, and store of value, it's really worthwhile. So a big part of that story is cryptography and replication, that is having those copies, and cryptographic verification schemes. And the other big part is decentralization. Blockchain behavior can't occur solo. It only occurs with many different machines around the globe controlled by many people, making lots of decisions and checking up on each other's work. So the software, it's like robot accountants checking up on each other's work. And these robot accountants allow us to get rid of trusted third parties. Trusted third parties are security holes, they're lawyer magnets. In the Bitcoin ecosystem, the only time Bitcoin itself, the miners and the nodes have been hacked, B3000, and that's a border gateway protocol on the underlying internet. So it's actually a hack on the underlying internet that allowed this, an actual centralized part of the internet. So even that makes the point that it's centralization. It's the problem. Security problem. And, but centralized exchanges, cryptocurrency exchanges, in fact, numerous times, hundreds of millions of dollars stolen. And interestingly enough, lawyers behave the same way as attackers in this regard. Bitcoin-related lawsuits are generally directed against exchanges and other such centralized nodes, and much more seldom against miners or full nodes. So let's now review the long history of money just very briefly, and help us understand why we want cryptocurrency. What's wrong with the good old dollar or the euro, and using PayPal or Venmo if we want digital dollar or euro. What's called modern fiat money, and it seems quite normal to us. It's the only kind of money we've experienced in our lifetimes, but historically speaking, it's actually very unusual to have trust-based and fiat money. So for the vast majority of human history, we had things like shell beads, copper and gold beads, silver coins, that kind of thing, which is trust minimized. You weren't relying on a bank or some central authority for its value. And that was based on trustworthy natural scarcity. It was based on the so on. And so I've studied the origins and history of money quite extensively, and the main lesson I learned from that is that the design of money is very far from arbitrary. It's not just, we decide on subjective value on some arbitrary thing. Even though the diversity of forms would lead to that, and just with a naive look at it, it turns out not to be some consistent properties. I've gone into those more extensively. Anyway, you can have good and bad designs for money, you can have good or bad technology, and it doesn't have to be good. So cryptocurrency applies computer science to this problem, and combining the efficiency and convenience of digital money with the trust minimization that was expected of traditional. So probably the earliest trust minimized cryptocurrency proposal, as mentioned, Bitcoin, but it was a design and a proposal, and Bitcoin, which came out in 2009, was in advance over that. Incorporated some technical advances in the design, made it more trust minimized, and it also was actual software rather than design. So that was huge, and of course took off. And so Bitgold was a 2-layer design. Bitgold, the underlying layer for settlement, and there was a more efficient and private layer called Chami and eCash for your. And so I've always thought of Bitcoin also as evolving into 2-layer. So its core layer, Bitcoin, capital B Bitcoin, optimized for trust minimization and security rather than for fee minimization or performance. And then at higher layers above that, Lightning, higher layers above Bitcoin that give you more efficient transactions in smart contracts. Getting smart contracts now. So in the early 1990s, as mentioned, I came up with some ideas for smart contracts and coined that phrase. And so let's first look at why contracts. According to legal scholar William Markham, contract law lies at the heart of our system of laws and serves as the foundation for our entire society. Our basically free market capitalist economy based on economies that aren't based on tanks rolling down the streets, are based on contracts. Contract law is a core class of first-year law school. Every time we do a deal, we have a legal contract. And so contracts allow people who are part of a deal to make their own rules that govern that business relationship. And that kind of spirit should apply to smart contracts. And so why do we make contracts? Well, we're building things or providing services, combining diverse people, objects, into value-producing combinations, global supply chains. And those combinations produce value. So we have to get these people together and they agree to do a deal. And so, for example, you think of a car engine with tens of thousands of parts. Most of those parts have to be outsourced. It's this simply scalable way. And to many different companies using contracts. And that means doing deals. So parties to the contract, call them Alice and Bob. They want a deal that makes them better off, even though they may be strategically combative with each other. They might not trust each other very far, but they want to do a deal. And so that requires laying down rules for the participants. They have to follow them. In the case of smart contracts, sometimes protocols automatically do part of it, or they're motivated to follow them by things like collateral, or in the traditional contracts, the threat of lawsuit, and reputation, and so forth. And contracts are ubiquitous. They are the most fundamental building blocks of our economy. And we want to do the same thing with smart contracts. So think of a smart contract as a vending machine, as a simple form of smart contract. And you can imagine a lawyer writing up vending machine behavior as a traditional contract. The party of the first puts in 4 quarters before said party gets a soda. If party puts in a $1 bill. Party puts in a $2 bill. Back a soda and 4 quarters. But instead of tediously laying it out like this, and what do that? And we can think of smart contracts as security protocols that control over things, conditional on states of the world, and the performance of computer verifiable obligations. In other words, based on who did what when, or what happened when a smart contract changes control over assets. The assets can be on-chain things like cryptocurrencies, tokens, on-chain rights that control cash flows. And in the future, they may be able to control some kinds of off-chain assets as well. Google my name and proplets. I have a proposal for doing it. So the most basic and common thing that smart contracts do is verify performance. Some asset transfers or other performances conditional on others or on real-world data or events. So a good smart contract keeps track of whether people are doing jobs, delivering their packages, cash flows, and so on. And right now, you can only keep track on-chain of a small subset of formal things, and as more off-chain things get incorporated in things called oracles, then more things can be kept track of. And it changes based on these events. It changes the state of the on-chain collateral, ultimately control over those assets accordingly. Some of the benefits of smart contracts include versus traditional ones include they handle more complexity. So contracts for difference, for an example, are based on a complex algorithmic calculation of prices. And so you really realistically could not do that before. And so a variation in theme on smart contracts is algorithmic management, and they're keeping track of a lot of simple, objectively measurable jobs that have various space and time requirements, such as, again, delivering packages systems. So another benefit is that more predictability is simpler and it lowers security legal risks, and that's especially important for cross-border deals and for dealing with more distant, culturally or politically distant parts of the world. And so, to dive in a little more in this contrast, wet code or smart contracts, wet code traditional law running on the brains of lawyers based on subjective lines and analogy. Dry code based on smart contracts based on Boolean bits and logic. Security based on was based on contempt, threat of fines, threat of imprisonment, ultimately. And dry code is based on security things we discuss, such as replication and cryptography. Predictability is flexible in traditional law, it's fairly rigid in dry code. Traditional law is much more mature than smart contracts. Smart contracts are just at the very beginning of this revolution. So legal security behind traditional contracts involves various coercive processes. We talked about the strict and rigid rules. You can look on traditional contracts also as role model for smart contracts, and especially the early simple contracts. You can go back to the Industrial Revolution times, earlier Renaissance medieval times, when contracts started. And they were much simpler than the highly elaborate, professional lawyer contracts done today. And those make some very good role models for starting out and designing smart contracts. Traditional contracts are more complementary than competing with each other because of those differences I just outlined. And so the best applications can really be both. For example, if you have an insurance application, include a claims adjuster in parts of the process, and they would have the signature authority to advance the process alone. And so whenever you use an intermediary, you can introduce them with signature authority in the smart contract. And you can have underlying traditional financial assets. I'll talk a bit more about that later on. So phases that we have looking for people to deal with. We have negotiation, handling, drafting. We have performance, and search and negotiations have been done pretty well by internet commerce, like app matching drivers, eBay, matching buyers and sellers, and eBay auction, and so forth. And Uber app price algorithm. But where they have not done so well is performance is when you actually do what was promised, when payments are made, when the normal asset transfers expected under the contract. And so smart contracts can really help with that aspect of it. And there's also the post-performance phase. Seizing bring collateral. Smart contracts can really help you with that by having on-chain cryptocurrency collateral. There's reputations, reviews on yield, performance phase, and of course, some traditional lawsuits, the threat of lawsuit. Contracts, the threat of lawsuit. And so let's now talk about cash flow, cash pool briefly. There's a whole category of smart contracts based on cash pools. You can have a signature authority of the cash pools. The cash pools can make distributions of cash flows. And so, for example, you could have a mirror asset that mirrors the financial behavior of an off-chain asset. You have some of the financially responsible parties responsible for holding that asset and adjusting the on-chain cash pool to reflect it. And then more automated trust minimized part that distributes cash flows from that. I think that's going to be very important pattern in the future of decentralized finance, is having traditional finance on one end and having a very trust minimized front end on the other end, on the customer end. And that cash flow pool creates that trust minimized barrier, and the rest of the cash flow distributions to be globally seamless.
And Mr. Szabo, we're going to take a 30-second break to fix some technical difficulties, and we will be back. I'm sorry about that quick interruption, and take it away.
Okay, so in conclusion, we talked about cryptocurrency and why trust minimized money is valuable. Then we discussed smart contracts and about why we make contracts and about the advantages and disadvantages of smart contracts. The dry code of smart contracts and protocols and blockchains versus the wet code of traditional contracts and lawyers. And we briefly looked at cash flow pools, an example of global financial machines, decentralized finance that smart contracts makes possible. And so when you put smart contracts on a good trust minimized blockchain, it provides plumbing for financial aspects of a service, which can now seamlessly cross trust boundaries, such as national borders. And it can go to a culturally, legally, politically much more diverse set of people. And we can look at traditional contracts, especially early simple financial contracts, as role models. And we can, with some creativity, reverse engineer them into smart contracts. And so to take best advantage of blockchains, we need to use the best of blockchain tech, trust minimized blockchains with the best of traditional finance. So I gave the example of an insurance application, great deal of it can be automated, but some parts of it can't. A lot of that is the claim adjustment process. And so you can put a claim adjuster in there with signature authority as part of the process. And traditional financial assets, you can have financially responsible parties holding the underlying assets and use cash flow pools to distribute that in a trust minimized way. Distribute those cash flows in a trust minimized way. And These are all based on the underlying technology of blockchains we talked about, and how a good trust minimized blockchain gives us global seamlessness and censorship resistance. And they can even be secure against rolling tanks. Thank you very much.
Nick, thank you so much. I was so pleased that you agreed to come speak to a Blockchain for Business conference, because I do see you as the poster man of the libertarian and cypherpunks. But today you talked to us about, using smart contracts and these technologies in very traditional ways, in, our traditional supply chains and in insurance businesses. So have you softened over the years, or what do you see as the adoption for traditional enterprises in this space?
Well, so there's many ways to deploy this technology, and certainly I favor, for various reasons, and politics is certainly not the only one. I give a bunch of others in my presentation. The trust minimized way. It allows you the global seamlessness. It allows you to deal with a much greater, in political terms and legal terms, much greater diversity of people. But when an enterprise gets involved, there's that. What I'm talking about is between enterprises, and within enterprises, you're still going to want your controls, and there's probably clever ways to combine this stuff with traditional controls on transactions that enterprises use within the corporation.
Are you ready for some questions from our students?
Sure.
Okay. So one of the students says, how are cryptocurrencies going to ever enter the markets with governments that seem to be, either behind the times or even openly hostile?
Well, one of the good news is you don't need the permission of governments for them to technically work. We have, Satoshi Nakamoto never asked anybody's permission. He just released Bitcoin, and we have, tens of thousands of copies running around the world. And so it's really a technology that you release and governments respond to in various ways. So in some sense, it's more like a law of nature than a law of man that is in operation here.
And what would you make of some central bank initiatives of having sort of a digital fiat currency? Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, so the kind of cryptocurrency I described is very different from what they're talking about. A fiat currency is trust-based, and so that's what they're proposing, are trust-based, centralized. Basically, what their proposals are more competitive with things like PayPal. It would end up, putting PayPal or Venmo out of business if they succeeded. I think PayPal and Venmo can do that kind of thing so much better than they can, that they're not really going to get very far. But if they succeeded, that's who they'd be putting out of business, not cryptocurrencies. Okay,
good. That was a good insight. And then I have a question from a student. When you talk to corporations, what is their main hesitation about automating smart contracts? I think you sort of answered it with the lawyers, but you might have something else to.
Yeah, it is a different paradigm, and so that takes a long time to communicate. You do have to integrate your internal controls with it, and so it's a long learning curve.
It is. And Nick, what are some of the things you're working on now? What are some of your passions now?
Well, I'm most good chunk on some different subjects these days, such as education, and I've always been interested in history, so I study a lot of that. And in terms of smart contracts, it's making smart contracts more negotiable. Like right now, smart contracts are typically, take it or leave it. Somebody wrote some code and you can use that code or not. And so I'm designing and developing some tools to make it more like building blocks, so that more people who aren't necessarily programmers can create smart contracts. And as part of that negotiation process, negotiating together with making your customized smart contract, smart deal.
So do you have any ideas on things like, when you think about the limitations of smart contracts, if this is embodied in code, you need if then else statements.
Mhm.
What can we do with clauses like change of character clauses or goodwill clauses? Have you given any thought to the fuzzier side of contracts?
Right. So I did mention that there are definitely some cases. If you want to talk fuzzy, one of the fuzziest areas is for verifying performance is construction industry. So I would expect, trying to figure out if the drywall was put in correctly and things are according to code to be among the later things that computers can take cognizance of, not earlier. So a lot of that is still far future. And like I said, they're complementary. So smart contracts certainly cannot do a lot of those subjective things, but you use them for what you can use smart contracts for verifying the performances like package delivery or payments or transfer of digital assets that you can use them for, and use traditional contracts in a complementary way for the things with more subjective clauses.
Okay, and we have some our students say, do you have any advice for them?
Do I have advice?
Yes.
Well, okay. I can sort of describe the path I went down. It was very broad based, like not super specializing necessarily. So, for example, my studies crossed history, legal history, law, getting a law degree, and computer science. Got a computer science degree as well, and quite a bit of study on top of that as well. So, it depends what you want to do. If you want to, innovate, taking a very broad-based approach is good. If you want to specialize in smart contracts, then, or in one of these areas, then a real focus, to become an expert is good.
I always say one of the things why I love being a professor, Nick, is when you're surrounded by all of these students who have the luxury of their general requirements. So they could be studying music and history and political science in addition to business. So that's great advice. I also wanted to ask you, so you put this out was it 1997?
Mm-hmm.
Did the world pay attention to it immediately, or is this just something that has been growing over time?
Well, certainly, vastly bigger than it was then. Yeah, it was a very specialized group of people talking about those things. One of the fortunate things happened was the internet itself. It brought a bunch of people together. Like, this never would have happened if it weren't for the internet bringing a bunch of people from around the globe together who had these sort of improbably parallel interests in these special, very obscure, specialized things back then. So.
Right. I also wanted to tell you, because I'm sure you haven't been on all day, but our associate director at the Blockchain Center of Excellence is also a libertarian and a cypherpunk, and he was about the 25th Bitcoin miner. So you are well represented at the University of Arkansas.
Okay,
you can tell I sort of represent more of the traditional business applications, but we try to cover it all here too. So my final question for you, Nick, you have been an inspiration to so many people. Who do you turn to for inspiration?
Well, of course, my dad inspired me, and there's various people in the libertarian world that have inspired me. Frederick Hayek comes to mind, for example. Computer scientists, Haber and Stornetta with their time stamping, David Chaum with his eCash, people who invented proof of work stuff. There's a long list of people that we always.
You've got a lot of heroes, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Well, you're one of ours. Nick, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming to speak today at the University of Arkansas. We all wish you well, and I'll continue to follow you. As much as you are followable, you're not you're not a big LinkedIn user, are you?
On Twitter, though.
Thank you so much. You have a great day.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Have a good one.
Okay.